There are moments when logic fades in the Pokémon world, replaced by something stranger and more playful. Creatures without arms somehow master punching techniques, while massive whales battle comfortably inside tiny indoor spaces. These oddities have existed since the beginning, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to notice. The games never explained them, never needed to, because wonder often thrives where reason hesitates. And before we drift any further, make sure to subscribe so once we reach 1,000 subs, I can reduce the ads. And tell me where you're watching from tonight. Wooper presents one of the most curious contradictions in Pokemon biology. This water ground type stands just over 1 foot tall with no visible arms whatsoever. Its body tapers smoothly from head to tail without any appendages that might qualify as limbs. Yet Wooper can learn Ice Punch through breeding or move tutors, somehow delivering a frozen fist to its opponents, despite lacking the anatomical equipment to form a fist at all. The move's animation shows the familiar punching motion, the same swift strike that Hitmonchan or Machamp would deliver. But Wooper simply performs the action without explanation, as if the universe itself decided that desire to punch outweighs physical possibility. Game Freak never addressed this inconsistency, never felt compelled to restrict certain moves based on logical body structure. Perhaps Wooper channels ice energy through its entire body, treating itself as the weapon rather than wielding one. Perhaps the punch exists as a conceptual attack that transcends physical form, manifesting wherever the user wills it. The game's internal logic permits the impossible because battles function on different rules than everyday physics might suggest. This pattern repeats across hundreds of Pokémon. Ghastly, a creature composed entirely of poisonous gas with no solid matter whatsoever, can somehow use Sucker Punch. The ghost type has no fists, no arms, no tangible substance that could deliver physical contact, yet it strikes opponents with dark type energy shaped into an attacking blow. The animation remains consistent with other punching moves despite Ghastly's incorporeal nature. Shroomish faces a similar anatomical puzzle. This grass poison type resembles a mushroom with 2 small feet but no arms extending from its rounded body. Nevertheless, Shroomish learns Drain Punch naturally as it levels up, absorbing health from opponents through a fighting type move that should require hands to execute. The mushroom simply performs the technique through sheer determination or perhaps some biological mechanism unknown to observers. These contradictions suggest that move categories function more as energy types than literal descriptions of physical actions. A punch might not require fists if the Pokémon can channel the appropriate force through alternative means. Fighting type energy could flow through any body part or simply manifest in the space surrounding the user without needing conventional limbs as conduits. The developers likely prioritized gameplay variety over strict anatomical accuracy. Allowing Pokémon to learn diverse movesets keeps battles interesting and gives players more strategic options when building their teams. If every creature could only use moves that perfectly matched its body structure, the game would lose much of its tactical depth and creative flexibility. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, consider how size becomes meaningless during indoor battles. The Pokédex lists Wailord at 47 feet long and weighs nearly 800 pounds. This massive whale dwarfs most buildings and could barely fit through standard doorways. Yet, trainers routinely send out Wailord inside gymnasiums, inside Pokémon centers, inside caves with low ceilings, and the creature materializes without difficulty. The spatial impossibility goes unacknowledged by the game world. Wailord appears at full size, regardless of the arena's dimensions, floating mysteriously in battles that take place within confined indoor spaces. The ceiling doesn't crack, the walls don't buckle, and spectators standing mere feet away show no concern about being crushed by the sudden appearance of something larger than most vehicles. This suggests that Pokeballs don't simply shrink Pokemon for storage, but perhaps create pocket dimensions where the creatures exist in compressed form until released. When the ball opens, maybe it projects the Pokemon into a localized space that overlaps normal reality without fully occupying it. The whale you see battling indoors might be a three-dimensional manifestation, while the actual mass remains partially stored elsewhere. Alternatively, the game simply ignores scale for practical reasons. Programming dynamic environment destruction based on Pokemon size would complicate every battle unnecessarily. Players accept the abstraction because they understand that gameplay convenience matters more than strict realism in a world where children befriend electric mice and fight god-like dragons. Other massive Pokemon face the same size contradiction. Steelix measures over 30 feet long as a steel snake that burrows through solid rock. Sending it out inside someone's house should demolish the building instantly, yet Steelix coils comfortably in living rooms during story battles without damaging the furniture. Groudon stands 11 feet tall and weighs over 2,000 pounds, but it fights inside the confined space of a submarine without an issue. The game treats all Pokemon as if they occupy roughly similar amounts of battle space, regardless of their canonical measurements. This creates a strange equality where a tiny Joltik battles on even ground with a towering Rayquaza, both creatures somehow existing at scales that permit meaningful interaction. The visual representation suggests similar sizes even when the lore insists otherwise. Perhaps trainers and Pokemon share an unconscious agreement to perceive battles through a normalized lens. Maybe the energy released during combat creates temporary spatial distortions that accommodate participants of any size. Or perhaps the games simply ask players to accept abstraction as part of the fantasy, trusting that imagination will fill gaps that programming cannot. HM moves introduce their own layer of logical confusion. These field abilities supposedly require specific techniques that only trained Pokemon can perform, yet the restrictions feel arbitrary when examined closely. A small tree blocks your path through the forest, and the game insists you need cut to remove it. Fire-type Pokemon could easily burn it down, fighting types could smash through it, and various other creatures possess the physical capability to clear the obstacle without special training. Machamp punches mountains for recreation, according to its Pokédex entry, capable of moving continents with its strength. Yet this fighting type cannot break the tiny rocks scattered along routes unless it specifically learns Rock Smash. The move itself seems redundant for a creature whose entire existence revolves around overwhelming physical power. Machamp's fists should shatter boulders automatically, not require a special technique learned from a hidden machine. The HM system exists purely for gameplay progression, creating gates that prevent players from accessing certain areas until they've advanced far enough to obtain the necessary moves. The in-world justification remains flimsy because dozens of Pokemon should theoretically bypass these obstacles through their natural abilities. Charizard flies constantly, carrying trainers across vast distances in the anime, yet it cannot use Fly in the games without learning the HM first. This creates an odd scenario where Pokemon possess capabilities they cannot utilize until a human teaches them through artificial means. The moves already exist within their potential, but something prevents their activation until specific conditions are met. Perhaps HMs don't actually teach new techniques, but rather unlock permissions that society has placed on certain actions for regulatory purposes. The badge requirement for using HMs outside battle strengthens this theory. Pokemon cannot cut trees, surf across water, or fly between cities until their trainer earns specific gym badges, suggesting that legal restrictions, rather than physical limitations, prevent these actions. Wild Pokemon presumably face no such barriers, cutting through forests and swimming freely without need for human authorization. This implies that trained Pokemon operate under a different set of rules than their wild counterparts. Once captured, they enter a system that governs their behavior through cultural expectations and legal frameworks. The badges serve as licenses, granting permission to perform certain acts rather than unlocking hidden powers. A. Pidgey knows how to fly from birth, but it cannot carry a trainer until that trainer proves themselves worthy through gym victories. Yet the system breaks down when you consider fainted Pokemon. A creature that has lost all its health and lies unconscious in your party can still use HM moves in the overworld. Your fainted Pidgeot somehow carries you across the region, despite being knocked out. Your unconscious Lapras serves as a surfing mount, even though it should be too weak to support your weight or navigate properly. The game treats fainting as a temporary inconvenience that prevents battle participation but doesn't actually incapacitate the Pokemon for other purposes. This creates the deeply uncomfortable image of trainers riding limp, barely conscious creatures as if they were vehicles rather than living beings. The Sharpedo you're surfing on has 0 health remaining, yet it paddles through the water, carrying you to your destination before presumably collapsing once you reach shore. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at how losing trainers pay their winners. Every battle concludes with the loser handing over prize money to the victor, a tradition so ingrained that nobody questions it. Children wagering their allowance, adult trainers betting significant sums. Everyone participates in this economy where battle outcomes directly determine financial transfers. The truly strange part comes when you defeat members of criminal organizations. Team Rocket, Team Magma, Team Plasma, regardless of which villainous group you're fighting, they pay you money after losing, despite actively trying to conquer the world or steal rare Pokemon. These criminals, who moments ago threatened violence or destruction, suddenly pause to hand over cash because that's what losing trainers do. Perhaps the payment system represents such a fundamental cultural norm that even criminals cannot bring themselves to violate it. Breaking this tradition might be considered more shameful than their actual crimes, a line that even villains refuse to cross. Or maybe the money represents energy or points within the universe's fundamental structure, automatically transferring from loser to winner through mechanisms beyond individual control. The amulet coin complicates this further by doubling all prize money earned from trainer battles. This held item somehow forces opponents to pay twice their normal amount, but the mechanics of enforcement remain mysterious. Do you show them the coin after winning and demand double payment? Do they willingly comply with its effect, despite having no logical reason to do so? If the amulet coin worked through intimidation or legal authority, trainers with insufficient funds would face problems. Some youngster with only 300 Pokédollars in their pocket shouldn't be able to pay 600 when you're holding the coin. Yet the game never shows trainers being unable to afford the doubled amount, suggesting the coin creates money rather than extracting it from finite resources. This points toward money functioning less like physical currency and more like a score or energy that manifests during transactions. The amulet coin might tap into this underlying system, drawing additional funds from the same source that generates the original payment. Trainers aren't actually carrying all that cash. They're accessing a shared economic field that crystallizes into usable currency when battles conclude. Roaming legendary Pokémon exhibit another logical impossibility. These rare creatures flee from battle the moment their turn arrives, vanishing before you can attack or catch them. The mechanic makes sense for creating challenge and encouraging preparation, but it falls apart when you apply status conditions before they escape. A sleeping Raikou somehow continues running between routes even while unconscious, and a frozen Latios flies through the sky despite being encased in solid ice. The game tracks these conditions persistently, so when you encounter the roaming Pokémon again, it still suffers from sleep or paralysis or whatever status you inflicted last time. This creates surreal mental images of these legendary creatures navigating the world while actively debilitated. Entei sprinting at incredible speeds while fast asleep, Suicune purifying water while frozen solid, Latias soaring through clouds while paralyzed. Perhaps legendary Pokémon exist partially outside normal reality, their essential nature unaffected by conditions that would completely incapacitate regular creatures. The sleep or paralysis might only impact them during battles when they're fully manifested in physical space. Between encounters, they slip back into a quasi-present state, where status conditions persist as abstract debuffs but don't actually prevent movement. This would explain how they continue roaming despite being functionally disabled. They're not really running or flying in the conventional sense. They're shifting their presence between locations through means that transcend ordinary locomotion. The frozen Latios isn't flapping icy wings through the air. It's repositioning its existence across the map using legendary abilities that don't require physical movement. The protagonist's rapid rise to power creates perhaps the largest logical gap in the entire franchise. A 10-year-old child who has never owned a Pokémon before somehow defeats every trainer in the region, conquers the Elite Four, becomes champion, and dismantles an entire criminal organization within roughly 20 hours of gameplay time. The game world treats this as normal when it should be extraordinary. Elite Four members supposedly train their entire lives to reach their position. Champions represent the pinnacle of regional talent, trainers who have dedicated decades to mastering their craft. Yet a complete beginner surpasses them all in less than a day of continuous gameplay, which translates to perhaps a few weeks within the game's timeline. Everyone else in the region seems remarkably incompetent by comparison. Gym leaders who have run their facilities for years pose only mild challenges. Veteran trainers with supposedly years of experience lose to someone who started their journey this morning. The evil team that has been planning their schemes for months gets thwarted by a child who literally just learned what a Pokeball is. The simplest explanation involves protagonist power, the narrative necessity for the player character to succeed regardless of logic. The games are designed to be beatable, so enemy trainers must be weak enough that a determined player can overcome them. But this creates an uncomfortable implication that the protagonist possesses supernatural talent that borders on the superhuman. Alternatively, perhaps the Pokémon world functions on principles where determination and fresh perspective matter more than experience. The protagonist succeeds because they approach situations without preconceptions, finding strategies that veteran trainers overlooked through habit. Youth and naivety become advantages when combined with the right Pokémon partners and enough persistence. If you're still awake halfway through, maybe subscribe before you drift off, and tell me what time it is where you're watching from. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, consider the arbitrary nature of which Pokémon can learn which HM moves. Scyther stands nearly 5 feet tall with large wings and a body perfectly designed for flight. Its entire design aesthetic screams aerial predator, a mantis built for slicing through air as easily as through grass. Yet Scyther cannot learn fly in generations, where that restriction applies, while tiny birds like Pidgey can carry full grown humans across entire regions. The image becomes absurd when you imagine riding a small pigeon between cities while your giant mantis, with actual wings, walks behind you on the ground. Scyther's wings work fine for its own flight during battle animations and idle movements, but apparently they cannot support a trainer's weight. Meanwhile, Pidgey, a bird barely larger than a real world pigeon, somehow carries a 10-year-old child without strain. The restrictions seem based on arbitrary game balance decisions rather than any biological logic. Scyther was likely excluded from Fly's learnable moves because game designers didn't want players accessing a strong bug type that could also serve as a flying transport. The decision makes sense from a mechanical perspective, but creates these moments where players notice the inconsistency and wonder. Similar oddities appear throughout the move learning system. Pokémon with massive jaws and prominent teeth sometimes cannot learn Bite. Fire types whose bodies contain obvious flames cannot always learn Fire Fang. Water types that live in oceans may lack access to Dive. The developers balanced gameplay first and worried about logical consistency second, if at all. Another crooked detail appears when you examine the impossibly small ledges that trainers cannot climb. These raised surfaces stand perhaps 6 inches high, barely qualifying as obstacles for anyone with functioning legs. Children jump off them constantly, hopping down to lower paths with ease, but climbing back up proves completely impossible without lengthy detours. The protagonist could simply step up or use their flying type Pokémon to lift them over the tiny barrier. Instead, they walk around entire routes, navigating through caves and across bridges, all to bypass a ledge that reaches their shins. The restriction exists purely for level design purposes, creating one-way paths that prevent players from accessing areas in the wrong order. The game never acknowledges how absurd this limitation appears. NPCs don't comment on the protagonist's inability to climb small obstacles. No one suggests using Pokémon to assist with vertical movement outside designated HM uses. The restriction simply exists as an invisible rule that everyone obeys without question, another instance where gameplay mechanics override common sense. Caves present their own spatial mysteries. Mant Moon in Kanto, Victory Road in multiple regions, Granite Cave in Hoenn, all these locations are described as treacherous locations requiring careful navigation. Yet they're all remarkably well lit, with clearly marked paths and convenient item placements. Rock Tunnel stands out as the lone cave that actually requires Flash to navigate, and even then, the layout remains simple enough that players can stumble through in the dark. The caves never contain actual danger, despite being natural formations that should pose serious risks. You don't encounter unstable ground, sudden drops, tight squeezes, or any environmental hazards that real caves present. Wild Pokémon attack, certainly, but the geography itself remains perfectly safe. Trainers stand inside these caves for indeterminate periods, apparently unbothered by lack of food, water, or exit strategies. This creates an image of people who simply decided to live in caves for no explained reason, fighting anyone who passes through, rather than, perhaps, leaving. They don't seem to be exploring or on missions. They're just standing there, waiting for the protagonist to arrive so they can battle. The game treats them as permanent fixtures of the environment rather than temporary visitors. Pokémon storage raises fascinating questions about space and consciousness. Bill's PC system allows trainers to store hundreds of Pokémon digitally, converting living creatures into data that exists somewhere in cyberspace. The Pokémon remain conscious inside the system, able to be withdrawn at any time, but what do they experience during storage? The games never explore this deeply unsettling premise. You're essentially trapping creatures inside a computer, reducing their existence to information patterns that wait in digital stasis until needed. They don't age or hunger or require care while stored, suggesting that time passes differently for them, or perhaps doesn't pass at all. The moment they're withdrawn, they resume as if no time elapsed. This technology should revolutionize every aspect of society beyond just Pokemon training. If living beings can be converted to data and stored indefinitely without negative effects, humans could potentially use the same technology. Transportation becomes trivial when you can upload yourself at one location and download at another. Resources scarcity disappears when you can store unlimited amounts of matter in digital space. Yet the games show no evidence of this technology being applied beyond Pokemon storage. Only creatures can be placed in the PC, not the items or people or anything else. Perhaps some fundamental property of Pokemon makes them uniquely compatible with this process. Maybe their ability to survive inside Pokeballs creates a biological foundation that permits digital conversion. The Pokeball itself remains the franchise's greatest unexplained technology. These handheld devices can capture creatures ranging from tiny bugs to godlike dragons, compressing them into portable size while keeping them alive and healthy. The balls apparently read the captured Pokemon's consciousness, determining when they wish to escape and only opening if certain conditions are met. This implies that Pokeballs contain artificial intelligence sophisticated enough to monitor and interpret complex emotional states. They must also regulate the internal environment, providing whatever the stored Pokemon needs to survive without food, water, or air from outside. Some balls are described as more comfortable than others, suggesting they create entire habitable spaces inside that somehow fit within a sphere smaller than a baseball. The energy requirements alone should make Pokeballs impossible. Compressing matter to that degree and maintaining a stable internal environment would require power sources that dwarf anything humanity currently possesses. Yet in the Pokemon world, even basic Pokeballs sold for $200 work reliably without any external power source or maintenance. Perhaps Pokeballs don't actually compress Pokemon physically, but create pocket dimensions accessed through the ball's mechanism. The creature enters its own private space that exists somewhere outside normal reality, connected to the ball through technological means. This would explain how balls can be thrown and broken without killing the Pokemon inside, because the creature isn't actually contained within the physical sphere. TMs and HMs exist as another technology that should revolutionize education, but somehow remains confined to teaching Pokemon moves. These discs contain knowledge that can be instantly uploaded into a creature's mind, granting them perfect understanding of complex techniques without practice or training. Early generations consumed the TM after one use, suggesting they weren't simply instructional videos, but actual knowledge transfer devices. If humans possess technology that could instantly teach skills, education would transform overnight. Students could master mathematics, languages, and complex subjects in moments rather than years. Professional training would become nearly instantaneous. The entire structure of learning and expertise would collapse and rebuild around this capability. Yet only Pokemon can use TMs. The games never explain why this limitation exists, or what property of Pokemon biology makes them compatible with the technology while humans are not. Perhaps Pokemon minds work differently, more receptive to direct knowledge insertion. Or maybe the technology specifically targets whatever mechanism allows Pokemon to level up and learn new moves through battle experience. The move learning process itself defies explanation. Pokemon grow stronger through combat, somehow gaining perfect understanding of new abilities at specific level thresholds. A Charmander knows Scratch and Growl from birth, but spontaneously learns Ember at level 9, despite never practicing fire breathing or receiving instruction. The knowledge simply manifests as if downloaded from some universal database when the Pokemon reaches the proper strength. This suggests that moves exist as latent potential within each Pokemon's genetics, waiting to activate when certain conditions are met. Level thresholds might trigger genetic expressions that unlock new capabilities. Or perhaps Pokemon consciousness connects to a shared repository of techniques, and gaining experience strengthens that connection until new moves become accessible. Breeding mechanics create even stranger implications. Pokemon eggs appear despite no one ever witnessing the actual act of breeding. Daycare workers insist they don't know how the egg appeared, maintaining plausible deniability about whether Pokemon actually mate or if eggs manifest through some other process. The games deliberately avoid depicting or explaining reproduction beyond the sanitized appearance of eggs. Eggs themselves behave unlike any real-world eggs. They're incredibly durable, surviving being carried through battles, stored in computers, and transported across regions without any form of protection. Trainers never feed or rotate them, yet they develop normally. The eggs also seem to know when they're close to hatching, beginning to shake and glow moments before cracking open. The Pokemon that emerges matches its mother's species in most cases, suggesting matrilineal inheritance patterns. But the father's moves can pass to the offspring through breeding mechanics, indicating genetic information does transfer between parents. This creates situations where baby Pokemon know moves they shouldn't learn for many levels, having inherited techniques from their father's move pool. Ditto complicates everything further by being able to breed with any Pokemon, regardless of species, egg group, or apparent biological compatibility. This pink blob can transform its body to reproduce with creatures ranging from tiny birds to massive dragons, always producing an egg of the partner species rather than another Ditto. The implications become deeply strange when you consider what Ditto actually is and whether it possesses true consciousness or merely mimics life. Certain Pokemon pairs cannot breed despite obvious compatibility. Skitty and Wailord form the most infamous example, a pairing that should be physically impossible, yet functions perfectly within the breeding system because they share an egg group. The games never address the logistics of how a 3-foot cat successfully breeds with a 47-foot whale, leaving players to imagine scenarios that become increasingly absurd. Gender ratios create situations where finding breeding partners becomes statistically difficult. Starter Pokemon appear as male 87.5% of the time, making female starters exceptionally rare. This disparity serves no explained purpose within the lore and exists purely to make breeding starters slightly more challenging. But it suggests something fundamental about these species that remains unexplored as we drift a little deeper into this topic. Consider how ghost types interact with the physical world. These Pokemon supposedly exist as spirits or supernatural entities, yet they obey the same battle rules as normal creatures. They take damage from physical moves, can be captured in ordinary Pokeballs, and require food and care like any other Pokemon. Some ghost types possess origin stories that explicitly state they're dead humans or Pokemon transformed into spirits. Yamask carries a mask that was once its face when it lived as a human. Phantump is described as a child who became lost in the forest and died, returning as a ghost, possessing a tree stump. These aren't metaphorical descriptions, but literal Pokedex entries claiming certain ghost types are the deceased given new form. This raises profound questions about death and consciousness in the Pokemon world. If human souls can persist, After physical death and transform into Pokémon, what happens to people who die without becoming ghosts? Do all deceased have the potential to return as ghost types, or only those who meet specific criteria? And if you capture a ghost type that was once human, what ethical considerations does that raise? The games never explore these implications deeply. Ghost types are simply another category of Pokémon, trainable and battleable like any other. Their potentially human origins don't affect how they're treated or perceived. Trainers catch Phantump and Yamask without apparent concern that they might be befriending dead children or using deceased humans in competitive battles. Some ghost types reportedly cause death to living beings through their mere presence. Gengar's shadow is said to steal life force. Dusknoir guides spirits to the afterlife. Chandelure burns souls as fuel for its flames. These Pokedex entries describe genuinely horrifying abilities that should make ghost types dangerous to be around, yet trainers keep them as partners without issue. Perhaps Pokedex entries exaggerate or describe abilities that ghost types can perform but choose not to use on trainers. Maybe the partnership between human and Pokemon creates a bond that prevents these deadly effects from activating. Or possibly the entries describe rare behaviors that only manifest under specific conditions rather than constant threats. Legendary Pokemon present their own category of logical impossibility. These unique creatures supposedly exist as singular entities, one per world, often tied to fundamental forces like time, space, or life itself. Yet players can encounter multiple copies through trading, and some legendary Pokemon can breed, despite being described as one of a kind. Manaphy produces Phione eggs when bred with Ditto, creating new Pokemon that resemble Manaphy but never evolve into it. This suggests Manaphy isn't truly unique, or that some property prevents Phione from achieving full Manaphy status despite being its offspring. The distinction feels arbitrary, designed to preserve Manaphy's legendary status while allowing players to obtain related creatures through breeding. Other legendary Pokemon cannot breed at all, belonging to the undiscovered egg group that excludes them from daycare mechanics entirely. This makes sense for gods that shape the universe, but feels odd for legendary Pokemon that clearly reproduce given their appearance in groups. The legendary birds in Kanto exist as single encounters, yet multiple Articuno, Zapdos, and Moltres appear in other regions, suggesting populations rather than unique individuals. Perhaps legendary describes rarity and power rather than absolute uniqueness. Most people might never encounter these Pokemon, making them legendary from a cultural perspective, even if multiple exist. Or maybe legendary Pokemon exist outside normal space-time, appearing as single entities from the player's perspective, while simultaneously existing as multiple individuals across different timelines or dimensions. The version-exclusive legendary Pokemon create even stranger implications. Depending on which game you purchase, certain legendary Pokemon exist in your world while others don't. Groudon appears in Ruby, but not Sapphire. Kyogre shows up in Sapphire, but not Ruby. Trading allows both to exist in a single game, but this suggests they're not truly unique universe-shaping entities if their presence depends on which version the player bought. This breaks the lore repeatedly. Groudon and Kyogre are described as ancient adversaries who shaped the land and sea through their eternal conflict. Yet one simply doesn't exist in certain timelines based on arbitrary version differences. The game's story remains identical whether you own Ruby or Sapphire, suggesting the absent legendary Pokemon never participated in the events they supposedly caused. Maybe each game represents an alternate universe where different outcomes occurred. The Ruby universe experienced different geological history than the Sapphire universe, resulting in different legendary Pokemon surviving to the present. But this explanation falters when both legendaries can exist simultaneously through trading, proving they're not mutually exclusive. Mega Evolution introduces a temporary transformation that supposedly results from strong bonds between trainer and Pokemon, plus special stones formed from specific energies. The mechanic looks impressive visually, but makes little biological sense. How does holding a stone and wearing a bracelet cause a Pokemon to spontaneously restructure its entire body into a new form? The transformation occurs mid battle, reversing automatically when the battle ends. This suggests Mega Evolution doesn't actually change the Pokemon's fundamental nature, but creates a temporary energy state that collapses without continuous input. The Pokemon isn't evolving in the traditional sense, but accessing a power mode that requires specific conditions to maintain. Some Pokemon suffer painful side effects from Mega Evolution, according to Pokedex entries. Mega Salamence's wings can't support its weight properly. Mega Tyranitar's body generates so much energy that it causes constant pain. These descriptions paint Mega Evolution as potentially harmful, yet trainers continue using it without apparent concern for their partner's well-being. Perhaps the Pokédex exaggerates negative effects, or maybe the pain is temporary and acceptable to Pokémon who gain significant power in exchange. The games never show Pokémon refusing to Mega Evolve or suffering lasting consequences, suggesting the transformation isn't as harmful as some entries imply. But the contradiction between lore and gameplay creates another gap where players must construct their own explanations. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at how weather affects battles. Rain Dance makes water moves stronger and fire moves weaker while enabling certain abilities. But the rain doesn't actually make fire types wet or cause them to slip. The effect is purely mechanical, boosting water type moves by a fixed percentage without any visible reason why water Pokemon suddenly hit harder. Similarly, Sunny Day strengthens fire moves and weakens water moves, but the battlefield doesn't dry up or catch fire. The weather exists as an abstract buff that modifies damage calculations without corresponding visual or logical effects. A Pokemon battling in harsh sunlight doesn't sweat or show signs of heat exhaustion. Rain doesn't create puddles or affect ground visibility. This abstraction allows weather effects to function as strategic tools without complicating battles with environmental interactions. But it reinforces how battles exist in a separate rules system from the normal world. The weather during combat affects move damage, but nothing else, following game logic rather than physical cause and effect. Hail and sandstorm damage all Pokemon except specific types at the end of each turn, representing environmental hazards that wear down participants over time. Yet the damage remains fixed regardless of the Pokemon's size, resilience, or defensive stats. A tiny Joltik takes the same hail damage as a massive Snorlax, suggesting the weather's effect operates through game mechanics rather than realistic interaction. Abilities that trigger in weather create even stranger scenarios. Cast Form changes form based on weather conditions, transforming from normal type to fire, water, or ice type when weather activates. The transformation happens instantly and reverses when weather ends, suggesting Cast Form's body responds to meteorological changes in ways that defy biology. Rain Dish heals Pokemon during rain, but the healing amount is fixed regardless of how much rain should logically affect the Pokemon. A water type that lives in oceans heals the same small amount as a fire type that should be weakened by moisture. The ability functions mechanically without considering what rain actually means for different species. Thunder's perfect accuracy during rain makes some physical sense, given that moisture conducts electricity better. But other weather interactions feel arbitrary. Solar beam requiring a charge turn in rain doesn't reflect how solar energy works. It's simply a game balance decision. Hurricane hitting perfectly through heavy rain defies how wind and precipitation actually interact. The game presents these interactions as consistent rules to memorize rather than logical cause and effect chains. Weather becomes a tactical element that skilled trainers manipulate, but it operates through game design rather than simulated meteorology. This keeps battles strategic while avoiding the complexity that realistic weather would introduce. Pokemon centers present another mystery. These facilities heal all injuries instantly and completely free of charge, no matter how severely damaged your team became. The healing technology appears flawless, capable of restoring Pokemon from near death to perfect health in seconds. Yet this miraculous medical technology is never applied to humans or used for any purpose besides Pokemon healthcare. Nurse Joy operates in every Pokemon Center across all regions, or rather, countless identical women, all named Nurse Joy, staff these facilities. The games never explain whether they're clones, part of a family with unusually stable genetics, or something else entirely. They all look identical, sound identical, and perform the same role with the same cheerful demeanor. The same situation applies to Officer Jenny, identical police officers found throughout the Pokemon world. These uniformed women maintain law and order while looking indistinguishable from each other. The games treat this as normal, never commenting on the strangeness of multiple identical people serving the same profession across vast geographic areas. Perhaps the Pokemon world has cloning technology that creates these service professionals, or maybe Nurse Joy and Officer Jenny are titles rather than individual names. The games deliberately avoid explaining this oddity, leaving it as another accepted weirdness that players eventually stop questioning. Pokemarts sell identical inventories in every location despite regional differences that should affect available goods. A shop in a desert town stocks the same items as one in a frozen mountain settlement. Prices remain fixed regardless of local economics or supply chain difficulties. This creates a perfectly balanced economy that functions more like a game and interface than realistic commerce. Items like revives and full restores cost thousands of Pokédollars but remain readily available in unlimited quantities. If healing items work as advertised, they should revolutionize medicine and command far higher prices than convenience stores charge. Yet trainers can purchase as many as they afford without depleting stock or affecting availability. The shops never close, never run out of inventory, and always buy items from trainers at half the retail price. These mechanics make sense for gameplay, providing reliable access to necessary items while creating a basic economic loop. But they paint a picture of an impossibly stable commercial system that never experiences supply problems or market fluctuations. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, consider how type advantages operate. Fire beats grass because fire burns plants. Water beats fire because water extinguishes flames. Grass beats water because plants absorb moisture. These relationships make intuitive sense, but others feel arbitrary or inconsistent with how elements actually interact. Fighting type moves are weak against poison types, supposedly because toxins weaken physical strength. But poison should make fighting types more dangerous, not less, by amplifying the damage their strikes cause. The type chart says fighting can't overcome poison, which contradicts the idea that fighting types represent a peak physical condition and discipline. Bug types resist fighting moves for unclear reasons. Insects are fragile and would logically suffer more from being punched than resisting such attacks. The relationship might reference how small size and agility help bugs avoid damage, but that should make fighting moves miss rather than deal reduced damage. Psychic types were originally weak only to bug type moves in Generation 1, a relationship that supposedly reflects common phobias affecting mental focus. But this explanation feels forced, designed to justify a game balance decision rather than flowing from logical type interactions. Why would psychic powers specifically struggle against insects more than any other threat? Dark type was introduced specifically to counter psychic types, representing evil or underhanded tactics that psychic powers cannot predict or overcome. This relationship works thematically, suggesting that malicious intent operates outside the rational thought patterns psychics rely on. But it still functions more as narrative design than physics-based interaction. Steel resisting nearly everything made sense when the type was introduced to counters psychic types and dragons. Metal armor logically deflects most attacks. But steel being weak to fighting type moves suggests that martial arts can overcome metal defense through technique, which feels inconsistent with steel's overall defensive theme. Fairy type arrived in Generation 6 to provide another dragon counter, creating a new set of relationships that don't always align with traditional fairy mythology. Fairies resist bug-type moves, despite folklore often depicting fairies as nature spirits closely connected to insects. Fairies are immune to dragon moves, reflecting how fairy tales often show clever weaklings outwitting mighty beasts. These type matchups function as a complex rock-paper-scissors system that creates strategic depth in battles. Memorizing the chart and building balanced teams becomes part of mastering the games. But the relationships work through game design rather than consistent internal logic, requiring players to learn the system rather than intuit it from how types should realistically interact. Moves like Endeavor and Pain Split ignore types entirely, dealing or redistributing damage based on HP percentages rather than type effectiveness. These moves suggest that some attacks transcend the type advantage system, operating through different mechanisms that bypass normal battle rules. Wonder Guard, as an ability, takes this further, making Shedinja immune to all moves that aren't super effective against it. This creates a Pokémon that can only be damaged through specific type matchups, weather, status conditions, or entry hazards. The ability suggests that some defensive techniques can completely negate whole categories of attacks regardless of their power. Moves that change a Pokémon's type mid-battle add another layer of complexity. Soak turns any Pokémon into a pure water type, completely overriding its natural typing. This transformation shouldn't be possible if types reflect a creature's fundamental nature. But the move works, suggesting types are mutable states rather than fixed biological properties. The frozen status condition creates situations where Pokémon are encased in solid ice, yet remain conscious and able to use certain moves. Ice types cannot be frozen, which makes sense thematically, but raises questions about what freezing actually does. If it doesn't affect ice types, maybe freezing isn't literally inksing Pokémon in an ice, but applying some other cold-based debilitation. Pokémon can battle underwater or in magma without any indication that environment affects them. Gyarados is a water type that lives in lakes and rivers, yet it takes full damage from water-type moves, as if being hit by Porygon somehow hurts an aquatic creature. A fire type standing in a pool of water doesn't automatically take damage or lose effectiveness, despite being surrounded by its weakness. These abstractions allow battles to function consistently, regardless of environment, but they create a disconnect between battle mechanics and the physical space where combat occurs. The rules apply uniformly, whether you're fighting on solid ground, in the ocean, or floating in space. Status moves that manipulate probability present logical challenges. Moves like Double Team raise evasion, supposedly creating duplicates that confuse opponents. But these duplicates vanish without explanation and don't affect anything besides making moves more likely to miss. They're not real copies, just game mechanical representations of increased dodging ability. Accuracy and evasion stats create situations where powerful moves consistently fail to connect. A Pokemon could use Minimize 6 times, becoming so small and evasive that even area of effect attacks somehow miss. This suggests attacks target specific points rather than regions, allowing tiny targets to avoid damage that should affect everything in an area. Priority moves always strike first, regardless of speed stats, representing quick reactions or guaranteed hits. But Sucker Punch only works if the opponent uses a damaging move, requiring the user to somehow know what action the opponent will take. The move's English name misleads, as it's actually a counterattack that predicts aggression rather than a literal surprise punch. Trick Room reverses speed order, making slower Pokemon move first for 5 turns. The move supposedly distorts space to achieve this effect, but what does that mean practically? Are faster Pokemon actually moving slower, or does Trick Room alter perception of time so slower actions complete before faster ones? These moves work consistently within game mechanics, creating strategic options that skilled trainers can exploit, but they operate through game logic rather than physics, requiring players to understand the system rather than imagine how these effects actually manifest during battles. Another quiet detail appears when you examine how Pokemon learn moves through breeding that they could never learn otherwise. A Larvitar can inherit Dragon Dance from a parent, despite not being a dragon type, and having no business knowing an attack based on draconic heritage. The move passes genetically, even though type and species suggest it shouldn't. This creates breeding strategies, where players deliberately chain parents to pass desired moves onto offspring, creating Pokemon with movesets they'd never naturally learn. The game treats this as intentional design, providing depth for competitive players who breed perfect Pokemon with optimal move combinations. But it raises questions about what moves actually represent. If they're genetic traits that pass through breeding, why do most Pokemon only learn specific moves at certain levels? If there are techniques that must be taught, how does genetic inheritance work? The system functions for gameplay purposes while creating logical contradictions. Egg moves sometimes include attacks. The offspring will eventually learn naturally at higher levels, just earlier than normal. This suggests egg moves unlock latent potential prematurely rather than granting entirely foreign abilities. But other egg moves provide access to techniques the Pokemon's species never learns independently, implying genetic inheritance can override natural move pool limitations. Some egg moves come from parents of completely different species and types. A water-type mother and dragon-type father might produce offspring that knows both water and dragon-type moves, despite being neither water nor dragon-type itself. The genetic mixing creates hybrid movesets that reflect both parents' capabilities even when they don't match the child's nature. This system allows creative team building, but makes move learning feel inconsistent. Sometimes moves are natural abilities that manifest through leveling. Sometimes they're genetic traits inherited from parents. Sometimes they're learned through TMs or move tutors. The game provides multiple conflicting explanations for how Pokemon acquire new abilities without settling on a unified model. Held items that boost stats or provide defensive benefits create scenarios where a Pokemon becomes vastly more powerful simply by holding an object. Choice. Band increases attack power by 50% just for holding a headband. How does wearing fabric on your forehead make you hit harder? The item doesn't grant additional strength, it multiplies existing power through unexplained means. Leftovers slowly restore HP each turn, suggesting the food continuously provides nourishment during battle. But the Pokemon never actually eats the leftovers, and the item never depletes or requires replacement. It exists as a permanent healing source that functions indefinitely without being consumed. Life Orb increases move power at the cost of HP after each attack. The item somehow channels the user's life force to strengthen attacks, creating a risk-reward dynamic where power comes from self-damage. But what mechanism allows an orb to convert HP into offensive strength? And why does the HP cost remain fixed regardless of the attack used or damage dealt? Focus Sash prevents one-hit knockouts by preserving the holder at 1 HP when they would otherwise faint. This suggests the item shields against lethal damage through some protective effect, but it only works once before breaking, implying it has limited durability. Yet Pokemon that survive, thanks to Focus Sash, show no sign of wearing to damaged equipment. These items function as stat modifiers and special effects within the battle system, providing strategic options without requiring consistent in-world explanations. Players understand that held items grant benefits through game mechanics rather than realistic cause and effect, accepting the abstraction as part of the battle framework. Weather rocks extend weather duration when held, somehow making rain or sun or sand last longer through the holder's presence. This implies weather in battles isn't actual meteorology, but a controlled effect that specific items can prolong. The rocks don't create weather, they amplify existing conditions, suggesting they work through resonance with whatever mechanism generates battle weather. Type-boosting items like charcoal or mystic water increase specific attack types when held. These items supposedly contain elemental energy that empowers related moves. But charcoal is just burnt wood, and mystic water is described as plain water. What property do they possess that translates into measurably stronger attacks? Perhaps these items work symbolically rather than literally. Holding them focuses the Pokemon's mind on their elemental nature, improving their execution of related techniques. The boost comes from psychological effects rather than physical properties, making the items focus tools rather than power sources. Some held items create effects that trigger conditionally. Weakness policy sharply raises offensive stats when the holder takes super effective damage, turning disadvantage into opportunity. But why would being hit by a super effective move make a Pokemon stronger? The item supposedly activates survival instincts, but that doesn't explain the mechanical stat it increases. Berries that provide various effects when consumed, healing status conditions, or restoring HP, or weakening super effective attacks. Unlike leftovers, berries do get consumed after activation, disappearing from the holder after providing their benefit. This makes them one-time, use resources that trainers must manage strategically. But Pokemon automatically eat berries when conditions for activation are met, requiring no input from the trainer. The Pokemon knows exactly when to consume its berry for maximum benefit, demonstrating either impressive battle awareness or some automatic triggering mechanism built into berry biochemistry. Some berries reduce super effective damage when consumed, suggesting they provide temporary resistance to specific types. A Choploo berry makes fighting type moves deal normal damage to the holder, somehow granting immunity to fighting energy through consumption of a fruit. The biological mechanism that would enable this remains unexplored. Other berries restore stats that have been lowered, raising attack or defense or speed back to normal levels. This implies the berries contain compounds that counteract whatever caused the stat reduction, working as antidotes to debuffs. But stat reductions come from various sources with different causes, yet berries cure them all equally well. The games establish that berries grow on trees and can be cultivated by trainers who plant them in soft soil. But berry trees mature impossibly fast, producing fruit within hours that provide measurable benefits during battles. Real agriculture requires seasons of growth, yet Pokemon berries ripen rapidly as if they operate on accelerated biological timescales. Perhaps the Pokemon world's environment contains higher ambient energy that speeds plant growth. Or maybe berries aren't normal fruit, but condensed elemental energy that takes plant form. The games never explain why berries grow so quickly or how they provide their various effects, treating them as convenient consumables that serve gameplay purposes. Abilities create perhaps the most varied collection of logical puzzles. Each Pokemon has at least one ability that provides some passive effect or conditional trigger. Some make intuitive sense given the Pokemon's nature. Water absorb healing water types. When hit by water, moves reflects how aquatic creatures thrive in their element. Other abilities feel arbitrary or create impossible scenarios. Truant forces a Pokemon to rest every other turn, unable to act half the time because it's too lazy. But this is described as an unchangeable trait rather than a behavioral choice, suggesting laziness is somehow genetically encoded as a mandatory rest cycle. Slow start reduces a Pokemon's offensive stats for its first 5 turns in battle, supposedly because it needs time to get going. But Regigigas is described as a legendary Pokemon that moved continents in ancient times. Why would such a powerful creature require a warm-up period before reaching full strength? Wonder Guard makes Shedinja immune to all non-super effective attacks, creating a defensive ability that shouldn't be possible. The Pokemon takes 0 damage from entire categories of moves regardless of their power, suggesting either perfect defense or a fundamental incompatibility between certain attacks and Shedinja's unique body. Shedinja itself defies biology, described as the shed shell of Nincada that somehow gained life after evolution. It has only 1 HP and cannot be healed through normal means, existing in a perpetual near-death state. Yet it battles effectively and survives hits that would instantly defeat it if not for Wonder Guard. Moody randomly raises one stat and lowers another each turn, creating unpredictable power fluctuations that represent mood swings. But stats shouldn't change randomly based on emotions during serious battles. The ability suggests some Pokemon lack emotional control to a degree that significantly impacts their combat effectiveness. Forecast changes. Cast forms type based on weather, transforming its fundamental nature in response to meteorological conditions. This implies types aren't fixed biological properties, but adaptable states that certain Pokemon can shift between. But most Pokemon cannot change types at all, suggesting cast form possesses unique genetic flexibility. Zen mode causes Darmanitan to transform from fire type to fire psychic type when its HP drops below half, supposedly entering a meditative state that grants psychic powers. The transformation reverses when HP rises again, suggesting the psychic abilities aren't permanent capabilities, but emergency responses to danger. Disguise allows Mimikyu to survive one hit completely unscathed, its costume taking damage instead. But the costume is just cloth. It shouldn't provide meaningful protection against powerful attacks. Yet the ability works, suggesting the disguise functions through supernatural means rather than physical blocking. Battle Bond transforms Greninja into a special form after it knocks out an opponent, supposedly strengthening the connection between trainer and Pokemon to unlock hidden power. This specific Greninja existed in the anime and was transferred into games, creating a unique individual that doesn't match normal members of its species. Power Construct allows Zygarde to transform into its complete form when HP drops below half, combining scattered cells into a more powerful configuration. This suggests Zygarde normally fights incomplete, deliberately limiting itself until sufficient threat warrants full assembly. These abilities create special cases and unique mechanics that differentiate Pokémon within species. Two Pokémon of the same type and species can function completely differently based on their abilities, adding strategic depth while creating more logical questions about how these traits work biologically. Hidden abilities exist as alternate options to normal abilities, available only through specific encounter methods. But the lore never explains what makes these abilities hidden or why certain Pokémon possess alternate capability sets. The distinction seems arbitrary, designed to create rare encounter goals rather than reflecting meaningful biological differences. Mega abilities replace normal abilities during Mega Evolution, sometimes granting completely new effects that the base form never possessed. Mega Charizard Y gains Drought despite regular Charizard having no weather manipulation capabilities. This suggests Mega Evolution unlocks latent potential that exists within the species, but remains dormant without the transformation. Other Mega Evolutions lose useful abilities in exchange for new ones. Mega Gengar loses Levitate, making it vulnerable to ground-type moves, despite being a ghost that floats naturally. The transformation somehow removes its immunity to ground attacks, suggesting Mega Evolution restructures a Pokémon's fundamental nature rather than simply enhancing existing traits. Some Mega Evolutions gain abilities that contradict their design. Mega Salamence gets Aerolate, turning normal-type moves into flying-type moves, but nothing about its Mega form suggests enhanced aerial affinity beyond its already existing flying type. The ability seems assigned for competitive balance, rather than thematic consistency with the design. Primal Reversion represents another transformation category unique to Kyogre and Groudon. These ancient Pokémon supposedly return to their original forms from prehistoric times, accessing power they once wielded when shaping the world. But if this is their true form, why do they exist in weaker states normally? Did they deliberately seal their own power, or does maintaining primal form require specific conditions? The red and blue orbs trigger primal reversion, suggesting these artifacts contain or channel energy necessary for the transformation. Without the orbs, Kyogre and Groudon remain in their normal states, despite theoretically possessing the capability to revert. This implies external factors control access to primal forms rather than the Pokémon choosing when to transform. Ultra Beasts exist as Pokémon from alternate dimensions with different evolutionary histories and ecological rules. They're described as invasive species that don't naturally belong in the main Pokémon world. Yet they can be caught in beast balls and function identically to normal Pokémon once captured, suggesting they're compatible with the same systems despite their alien origins. Some Ultra Beasts possess bizarre stat distributions that make them function unlike typical Pokémon. Kartana has extremely high attack but very low HP, creating a glass cannon that hits hard but falls quickly. Celesteela has balanced defensive stats that make it a bulky wall rather than an offensive threat. These stat spreads reflect their alien natures, creating Pokémon that challenge conventional team-building assumptions. Beast Boost, as a shared ability among most Ultra Beasts, raises a Pokémon's highest stat after each knockout, creating momentum that allows sweeps if not stopped quickly. This ability doesn't exist among normal Pokémon, suggesting Ultra Beasts gain power through different mechanisms than creatures native to the main dimension. The concept of alternate dimensions raises questions about what makes the main game's universe special. If infinite universes exist with different versions of all Pokemon, why does the story focus on this specific timeline? What makes the protagonist's reality more significant than countless parallel worlds where similar events unfold differently? Link cable evolution in Legends. Arceus changed how trading works, allowing Pokemon that normally require trades to evolve through item use instead. This suggests trade evolution wasn't actually necessary, but existed as a social mechanic to encourage interaction between players. The lore never explained why some Pokemon needed exposure to another trainer to evolve when the same effect can apparently be achieved through items. Kadabra's evolution into Alakazam, requiring trade, created an infamous controversy involving Uri Geller, the spoon-bending performer who sued over Kadabra, supposedly referencing him. The lawsuit caused Game Freak to stop printing Kadabra cards in the trading card game for years, creating a gap where Abra jumped directly to Alakazam in card form without its middle evolution appearing. This legal issue demonstrates how real-world concerns can affect fictional creatures. Kadabra exists as intellectual property that became entangled with a celebrity's image rights, forcing the company to navigate permissions and lawsuits over a Pokemon that simply held spoons and knew psychic attacks. Trade evolutions like Gengar, Alakazam, Machamp, and Golem were designed as version 1 as incentives to connect Game Boy systems and trade with friends. But this created situations where players without trading partners couldn't complete their Pokédex or access certain powerful Pokémon. The mechanic worked socially, but punished isolated players who had no one to trade with. Later generations introduced held item trade evolutions, requiring Pokémon to hold specific items when traded to trigger evolution. This added complexity while maintaining the social aspect, creating more evolution conditions that players needed to memorize. Why some Pokemon needed items during trades, while others evolved from trading alone, remains unexplained within the lore. Porygon's evolution line creates confusion through its digital nature. Porygon evolves into Porygon 2 when traded holding an upgrade, and Porygon 2 evolves into Porygon Z when traded holding a dubious disc. These items supposedly upgrade the digital Pokemon's programming, but if Porygon exists as artificial intelligence running on what hardware? Pokemon clearly aren't computers, despite being stored as data in PC systems. The dubious disc is described as causing Porygon 2's evolution to be incomplete or glitchy, creating Porygon Z with erratic movements and unstable behavior. This suggests digital Pokemon can malfunction through bad updates or corrupt data, but Porygon Z remains usable and battling incapable, indicating the glitches don't actually impair its functionality, despite the Pokédex describing problems. Evolution through happiness creates a measurement of emotional bonds that the game somehow quantifies numerically. Pokemon that are happy with their trainers evolve at specific friendship thresholds, suggesting emotions can be measured objectively and trigger biological changes when they reach certain levels. But what mechanism translates feelings into physical transformation? Happiness evolution implies. Pokemon require love or satisfaction to reach their full potential. Eevee evolves into Espeon or Umbreon depending on time of day when friendship is maxed, suggesting environmental factors combine with emotional states to determine outcomes. The same Pokemon with identical happiness could become different evolutions purely based on when the level up occurs. This creates situations where trainers might accidentally trigger unwanted evolutions by raising friendship too quickly. Everstone prevents evolution when held, allowing trainers to maintain Pokemon in specific forms. But why would a stone stop biological processes triggered by happiness? The item supposedly works through unknown means, another case of game mechanics lacking in world explanations. Friendship points accumulate through various actions, including walking with Pokémon, using them in battle, giving them vitamins, or grooming them. These activities build bonds that eventually trigger evolution, suggesting that time spent together and care received directly impact biological development. But the system reduces complex emotional relationships to numerical values that increase predictably through specific actions. Pokemon Amy and Pokemon Refresh allow trainers to interact with their team through petting, feeding, and cleaning them after battles. These features increase affection separate from friendship, creating two different emotional stats that affect different outcomes. High affection provides battle benefits, like increased critical hit rates or surviving attacks that should cause fainting, suggesting that Pokemon perform better when they feel loved. But this raises uncomfortable questions about Pokemon that fight for trainers without affection. Are they less motivated, or does affection simply represent a mechanical advantage that has no bearing on how the Pokemon actually feel? The game treats affection as measurably beneficial, implying that emotional connection literally makes Pokemon stronger through unknown mechanisms. Another quiet detail appears when we examine how Surf works mechanically. This water-type move hits all adjacent targets in multi-battles, creating a wave that damages everyone except the user. But if you're riding a Pokemon using Surf outside battle, that same creature can somehow use the move without hitting you. The trainer remains dry despite their mount launching water attacks. This suggests Surf functions differently in and out of battle. The overworld version provides gentle transportation, while the combat version creates damaging waves. The same move produces opposite effects depending on context, operating through game design rather than consistent physics. The Pokemon can control Surf's intensity or targeting despite no visible mechanism for such precision. Fly poses similar contradictions. During battles, Fly takes two turns, with the user ascending out of reach before diving to attack. Outside battle, Fly instantly transports trainers between cities without the dramatic rise and fall shown during combat. The move functions as either an attack or fast travel depending on context, suggesting it represents multiple different capabilities given the same name. The two-turn flying attack leaves Pokemon vulnerable only to specific moves during their airborne turn. Thunder, Sky, Uppercut, Gust, and a few others can hit flying targets, but most attacks fail to reach them. This implies the Pokemon ascends high enough that normal attacks can't connect, yet specific moves somehow have sufficient range or homing ability to strike aerial opponents. Dig works identically to Fly, but underground instead of airborne. The user burrows on turn 1 and emerges to attack on turn 2, avoiding most damage while submerged. But ground is denser than air, making underground movement harder than flight. How does a Pokemon dig deep enough in one turn to avoid attacks, then emerge precisely where they need to attack the opponent? The timing requires perfect calculation, performed while underground, without visual reference. Moves that require charging turns create situations where Pokemon temporarily leave the battlefield. Dive, Phantom Force, Shadow Force, and Bounce all follow this pattern. The user vanishes for one turn, becoming untargetable by most moves, then reappears to strike. But where do they go during that vanishing turn? Phantom Force and Shadow Force supposedly send ghost types into another dimension briefly before returning to attack. This implies ghost Pokemon can shift between realities mid-battle, accessing spaces where most attacks cannot reach. But certain moves, like Hex, can still hit them even while phased out, suggesting they're not truly in another dimension, but somewhere adjacent that specific attacks can penetrate. Bounce sends the user high into the air before crashing down on the opponent. The description matches fly mechanically, but exists as a flying type move that various non flying types can learn. This suggests bouncing incredibly high functions differently than flying, perhaps requiring less sustained aerial capability. But reaching the same altitude through jumping rather than flight seems far more difficult physically. Moves like Solar Beam require charging sunlight for one turn before releasing a powerful grass type attack. The charging period makes sense thematically, reflecting how plants gather solar energy. But Sunny Day removes the charge turn, suggesting that brighter sunlight allows instant energy collection. This implies the normal sun doesn't shine brightly enough for immediate solar beam use, despite being the same celestial object. Focus Punch requires concentration during the turn it charges, failing if the user takes damage before executing the attack. This makes sense narratively, suggesting that fighting type techniques require mental focus that damage disrupts. But many other charging moves work fine, even if the user gets hit during preparation, creating inconsistency about which moves require undisturbed charging versus tolerating interruption. Bide stores damage received for 2 turns, then releases double the total back at the opponent. This suggests Pokemon can somehow contain injury as energy that gets converted into an attack. The more damage absorbed, the stronger the counter-strike, implying that pain or harm function as fuel that specific moves can channel offensively. Counter and Mirror coat works similarly, returning physical or special damage with doubled power. These moves require the user to survive an attack, then immediately redirect twice its force back at the attacker. The doubled return suggests these defensive techniques don't simply reflect attacks, but amplify them through unknown means. Revenge and Avalanche deal doubled damage if the user took damage earlier in the turn, representing retaliation strikes empowered by anger or determination. But how does emotional response translate into measurably stronger attacks? The game treats motivation as a mechanical damage modifier, suggesting fighting spirit literally increases force applied. Pain. Split averages the current HP between user and target, redistributing health through supernatural means. The move doesn't heal or harm through normal methods. It simply equalizes HP totals, regardless of how much each Pokemon originally had. This implies life force can be transferred and balanced through techniques that ignore biology. Heal Pulse allows Pokemon to restore allies' HP without using healing items or visits to Pokemon centers. The move channels restorative energy across distances, mending injuries through projection rather than physical contact. If this technique exists, why aren't Heal Pulse users stationed everywhere, providing free healthcare? Memento causes the user to faint while sharply lowering the opponent's offensive stats. The move sacrifices the user to cripple enemies, functioning as a kamikaze technique that ensures mutual loss. But Pokemon don't actually die from Memento. They faint and can be revived normally. The sacrifice proves temporary, making the dramatic name and effect feel less final than described. Explosion and self-destruct deal massive damage, while causing the user to faint, representing ultimate sacrifice attacks. But as mentioned earlier, the Pokemon don't die or suffer permanent harm. They faint from the exertion of exploding, then revive at Pokemon centers good as new. The explosions apparently don't actually destroy their bodies, despite the devastating force displayed. Final Gambit deals damage equal to the user's current HP, then causes the user to faint. This fighting type move converts life force directly into offensive power, spending health as currency to damage opponents. The exchange rate is 1 to 1, suggesting HP functions as energy that can be projected outward rather than simply measuring durability. Healing Wish and Lunar Dance cause the user to faint while fully restoring the next Pokemon sent out. These moves sacrifice one team member to completely refresh another, treating life force or energy as transferable resource that can be given away. The user gains no benefit and faints immediately, making these purely altruistic techniques. Destiny Bond links the user and target so that if the user faints, the target faints as well. This creates a revenge condition where taking down the Destiny Bond user guarantees mutual defeat. The move suggests spiritual connection between Pokemon can be weaponized, binding fates together through ghost-type energy. Grudge causes the last move used on the user to lose all its remaining PP if the user faints from that move. This represents a dying curse that depletes the killing move's usability, preventing opponents from utilizing that technique for the rest of battle. The effect targets moves rather than Pokemon, suggesting attacks exist as resources that can be exhausted through supernatural means. Curse functions completely differently for ghost types versus other Pokemon. Non-ghosts use Curse to raise attack and defense while lowering speed, representing a trade-off between power and mobility. Ghost types use Curse to sacrifice half their HP to place a damaging curse on the target that deals damage each turn. The same move name describes opposite mechanics based on user type, creating potential confusion. This split functionality suggests Curse represents multiple different techniques that happen to share a name. Or perhaps the move channels different effects depending on the user's nature, with ghostly curses working through supernatural harm, while physical curses represent internal power redistribution. The game never clarifies why this one move behaves so differently across types. Transform allows Ditto and Mew to perfectly copy opponents, replicating their appearance, stats, moves, and even abilities. The transformation happens instantly and completely, suggesting these Pokemon can restructure their entire cellular makeup to match any target. But the copy isn't perfect, as transformed Pokemon retain their original HP and cannot copy Mega Evolutions without specific items. The limitations feel arbitrary. If Ditto can perfectly replicate everything about a Pokemon, including its genetic moves and learned techniques, why can't it copy HP totals? The game suggests that some properties are more fundamental and harder to alter than others. Moves and abilities can be mimicked, but the life force or energy capacity represented by HP remains tied to the original form. Imposter, as Ditto's hidden ability, transforms it into the opposing Pokemon automatically upon entering battle, removing even the need to use Transform manually. This instant change happens before the opposing trainer sees Ditto, creating situations where they might not realize a switch occurred. The automatic transformation suggests Ditto's body defaults to mimicry rather than maintaining stable form. Illusion creates false appearances without actually transforming. Zoroark appears as the last Pokemon in the party, fooling opponents about its type and identity until it takes damage or attacks. The illusion is convincing enough to display the disguised Pokemon's name and species, suggesting holographic projection or psychic manipulation rather than physical transformation. But the illusion breaks instantly when Zoroark takes any damage, suggesting it requires concentration to maintain. This implies Zoroark creates the false image through mental effort rather than technology, projecting an appearance that opponents perceive as real until proven otherwise through physical contact. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, Consider how the day-night cycle affects certain Pokémon and evolutions. The games track time of day and change lighting to reflect morning, afternoon, evening, and night periods. Some Pokémon only appear during specific times, suggesting their behavior follows circadian rhythms. But the cycle progresses far faster than real time, with days passing in hours rather than 24-hour periods. This compressed timeline creates situations where Pokémon that should be nocturnal appear during night that arrives in after a few hours of gameplay. The accelerated cycle exists for gameplay pacing, allowing players to access time-based content without waiting real days. But it suggests the Pokémon world experiences time differently than reality, with days and nights cycling rapidly by our standards. Umbreon and Espeon evolution requires high friendship and specific times of day, with Umbreon appearing during night and Espeon during day. This suggests Eevee's evolution responds to ambient light or circadian factors combined with emotional bonding. But why would time of day affect an evolution if friendship is the primary trigger? The connection between these factors remains unexplored. Rockruff evolves into different Lycanroc forms based on time of day, with day form appearing in daytime, night form in nighttime, and dusk form requiring special event Rockruff during evening. This creates three separate evolutionary outcomes from the same base Pokémon, suggesting genetic potential branches depending on environmental conditions during the transformation. Other Pokémon like Gligar and Sneasel require nighttime, plus held items to evolve. The combination of temporal and material requirements suggests complex conditions must align for certain transformations. Why these specific Pokémon need both factors, while others only require one, remains part of the mysterious nature of evolution. Daycare centers let trainers leave Pokémon to level up automatically, while the player adventures elsewhere. The Pokémon gain experience based on steps taken, growing stronger without participating in battles. This implies training doesn't require combat, that simple time and care can develop power. But the rate of growth seems suspiciously generous, with Pokémon gaining levels far faster than they could through normal gameplay. The daycare's breeding function produces eggs without explaining the actual reproductive process. Trainers leave two compatible Pokémon and return later to find an egg, with daycare workers claiming ignorance about how it appeared. This deliberate vagueness avoids depicting or discussing Pokémon reproduction directly, maintaining the franchise's family-friendly tone while enabling breeding mechanics. Some breeding pairs produce eggs impossibly quickly. Two compatible Pokémon left together can generate eggs within minutes of gameplay, suggesting gestation occurs nearly instantly. Real reproduction requires weeks or months, yet Pokémon eggs appear almost immediately. This accelerated process exists for gameplay convenience, but creates biological impossibilities. Flame Body and Magma Armor abilities have egg hatching time when their possessor is in the party, suggesting heat accelerates development. This makes some intuitive sense, as warmth helps many eggs hatch faster, but the abilities don't require the Pokémon to actually contact the egg, implying they radiate developmental energy that speeds growth through proximity alone. Eggs themselves are remarkably durable, considering they contain developing Pokémon. They survive being stored in PCs, carried through battles, transported across regions, and exposed to all weather without any protective containers. The shells must be incredibly strong, or perhaps not actual shells at all, but energy constructs that protect the developing creature inside. Hatching occurs when eggs accumulate enough steps, suggesting physical movement accelerates development. But why would walking help eggs hatch? Perhaps the motion simulates conditions the developing Pokémon needs, or maybe the energy expended through walking transfers to the egg somehow. The games never explain the mechanism behind step based hatching. Pokemon eggs display patterns that hint at their species before hatching, allowing experienced players to identify contents early. But eggs haven't developed these patterns through exposure to light or other external factors. They somehow know what species they contain and display appropriate markings from the beginning. This suggests eggs possess awareness or genetic expression before the Pokemon fully forms. Chain breeding allows moves to pass through multiple generations, with players breeding specific Pokemon together to transfer egg moves across species boundaries. A move might pass from father to offspring, then that offspring breeds with a different species to pass the move again. This creates inheritance chains, where moves travel through populations that could never naturally learn them. The complexity of chain breeding creates breeding projects that require multiple generations and careful planning. Competitive players spend hours breeding perfect Pokemon with ideal moves, natures, abilities, and IVs. The game never intended breeding to become this involved, but the mechanics support optimization for those willing to invest time. Individual values affect stats in ways that players cannot directly observe without specific in-game NPCs or external calculators. Each Pokemon has hidden IV numbers for every stat that range from 0 to 31, creating permanent modifiers that stack with other stat influences. Two Pokemon of the same species and level can have vastly different stats based solely on these hidden values. IVs supposedly represent genetic potential or innate talent, explaining why some Pokemon naturally grow stronger than others despite identical training. But the game provides almost no information about IVs during normal play, leaving most players unaware these hidden stats exist. Competitive players must use external resources or specific NPCs to judge IVs and breed for high values. Nature affects stats by raising one by 10% while lowering another, creating 25 possible nature combinations, including 5 neutral natures. A Pokemon's nature is determined randomly when encountered or hatched, requiring players to catch or breed multiple times to obtain desired natures. This adds another layer of optimization to team building. The concept of nature affecting stats suggests personality traits translate into physical capabilities. A bold nature increases attack while reducing defense, implying aggressive personalities hit harder but defend worse. But why would temperament affect physical attributes so directly? The game treats personality as a mechanical stat modifier without explaining the connection. Everstone passes the holder's nature to offspring when breeding, allowing players to control one variable while seeking good IVs. This creates breeding strategies where players use nature control combined with IV inheritance from parents to gradually produce optimal offspring over multiple generations. Destiny, not, changes breeding mechanics by passing 5 random IVs from parents to offspring instead of the usual 3. This item dramatically improves odds of hatching high IV Pokemon, but requires finding it first. Why a knot that supposedly binds fates would affect genetic inheritance remains mysterious, another case of items having effects that don't match their thematic description. Synchronize as an ability causes wild Pokemon to have the same nature as the Synchronize user 50% of the time. This creates a method for hunting specific natures without relying entirely on random chance. But how does Synchronize affect wild Pokemon before battle even begins? The ability somehow influences encounters it hasn't participated in yet. These hidden mechanics create deep complexity that reward players who research and optimize. But they also create barriers between casual and competitive play, with serious battlers needing to understand systems that the games barely acknowledge exist. The disconnect between apparent simplicity and hidden depth defines much of Pokemon's mechanical design. Effort values function as another invisible stat system, allowing Pokemon to gain specific stat boosts through defeating certain opponent types. Each Pokemon defeated grants EVs in one or two stats, with totals limited to prevent infinite growth. Training a Pokemon against specific opponents lets players control which stats increase beyond base growth. But EV training requires defeating hundreds of specific Pokemon to max out desired stats, creating a grind that casual players never engage with. Competitive teams invest dozens of hours into EV training each member, ensuring stats develop optimally. This hidden system rewards knowledge and effort, but remains completely invisible during normal gameplay. Power items change EV gains when held, adding extra points to specific stats while reducing speed temporarily. These items allow more efficient EV training by focusing gains on desired stats. But why would wearing a belt or band or anklet affect which stats grow from battle experience? The items work through game mechanics rather than any logical connection between equipment and stat growth. Pokerus exists as a beneficial virus that doubles EV gains when contracted. This rare status spreads between party members and persists until midnight, when it becomes inactive but permanent. The virus supposedly boosts growth and spreads through contact, functioning like actual diseases, but providing only positive effects. The rarity of Pokerus, combined with its significant benefits, makes it valuable for competitive breeding. Players who discover infected Pokemon often keep them stored to preserve active infection for spreading to others. This creates a community where Pokerus gets treated as a tradable commodity, with infected Pokemon being passed between players to help with training. But Pokerus provides no in-world acknowledgement beyond a brief mention from the nurse at Pokemon centers. NPCs don't react to infected Pokemon differently, and the virus doesn't appear in Pokédex entries or story content. It exists purely as a mechanical benefit that goes largely unexplained within the game's narrative. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, consider how repels and other encounter prevention items work. Repel supposedly emits an odor that keeps weak wild Pokemon away, but the effect works on all Pokemon below a certain level threshold rather than specific species. How does scent determine Pokemon strength rather than just repelling by species? The effect activates based on the first Pokemon in your party's level, creating situations where changing your lead Pokemon alters which encounters Repel prevents. This implies Repel doesn't have a fixed strength, but somehow adjusts based on who's leading your team. The item reads your party and calibrates its effect automatically through unexplained means. Max Repel lasts longer than regular Repel, but provides the same effect otherwise. The extended duration suggests Max Repel contains more repellent substance, but both versions work identically in terms of which Pokemon they deter. The leveling mechanic remains consistent regardless of repel quality. Cleanse. Tag reduces encounter rates when the holder is first in the party, supposedly warding off wild Pokemon through spiritual means. But the tag works indefinitely without being consumed or requiring replacement, suggesting it's a permanent ward rather than consumable repellent. How it determines encounter rates or affects wild Pokemon behavior remains unexplained. White Flute raises encounter rates, while Black Flute lowers them, providing alternatives to repels that work through sound instead of scent. But the flutes require playing, and NPCs never comment on hearing them. Either the sound operates at frequencies humans cannot detect, or the flutes work through game mechanics rather than actual audio. These encounter control items exist primarily for player convenience, allowing trainers to avoid constant wild battles while traveling. but they create a world where Pokemon apparently flee from certain scents or sounds without any visible reaction or acknowledgement of the item's presence. Escape Rope allows instant exits from caves and dungeons, teleporting trainers to the last Pokemon Center or entrance instantly. But the item is described as just a rope, which shouldn't enable teleportation. Perhaps using it signals rescue services or activates some transportation network, but the games never explain how rope facilitates instant travel. Dig can also escape dungeons outside of battle, functioning identically to escape rope, but using a move instead of an item. This suggests Pokemon can tunnel through cave systems rapidly enough to provide instant extraction. But caves span miles of rock with complex geology, making instant burrowing to exits physically impossible. The move works through game design rather than realistic tunneling. Teleport allows instant travel to the last Pokemon Center visited, providing another escape option. This psychic move makes more sense thematically than escape rope, as mental teleportation seems fitting for psychic types. But the limited destination suggests teleport cannot freely target any location, only places the user has visited and formed mental connections with. Fly enables travel between any cities the player has visited, functioning as unlimited fast travel between population centers. The move requires being outside to use, presumably because flying indoors would be dangerous. But Fly works instantly, suggesting either time compression during travel or transportation through means other than literal flight across the landscape. Soar in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire expanded Fly into a proper flight system, allowing players to control their Pokemon while flying across Hoenn. This version reveals that Fly is actual flight rather than teleportation, but it raises new questions about how Pokemon carry trainers for extended periods without fatigue. The games show various flying Pokemon in the overworld carrying trainers, but sizes don't always make sense. Tiny birds like Talo can somehow support human weight, despite weighing almost nothing themselves. This weight distribution and aerodynamics required would make this impossible, but the game abstracts these concerns away to provide gameplay convenience. Surfing presents similar size concerns. Small water types like Remoraid can serve as surf transports despite being tiny fish that should struggle to keep trainers afloat. The game treats all surf-capable Pokemon as equally viable water mounts, regardless of their size or swimming capability. Rock Smash allows Pokemon to shatter boulders, blocking paths, but only specific boulders in designated locations. Identical-looking rocks elsewhere cannot be smashed, and Pokemon strong enough to break boulders cannot clear tiny obstacles like small trees. The selective functionality reveals these as gameplay gates rather than physical barriers. Strength lets Pokemon push large stones across floors to solve puzzles, but many fighting types that learn strength possess enough power to simply destroy the boulders rather than push them. The game requires pushing because puzzle design demands it, creating scenarios where overwhelmingly strong Pokemon carefully nudge rocks instead of pulverizing them. Waterfall allows water types to swim up vertical waterfalls, carrying trainers, defying gravity through sheer swimming ability. The move works identically to Surf in terms of water navigation, but specifically enables vertical travel. How water types generate enough force to propel themselves and their riders straight up against flowing water remains unexplained. Flash illuminates dark caves, but only until the trainer leaves the area, at which point darkness returns. This suggests Flash provides temporary light rather than lasting illumination. But if it's just a bright flash, how does it maintain visibility for extended exploration? Perhaps the move creates sustained glow rather than a single burst, though the games never clarify. Defog removes fog and entry hazards from the battlefield, clearing visibility and removing invisible traps simultaneously. The wind generated supposedly blows away both natural weather effects and artificial battlefield hazards. But how does wind remove spikes or stealth rocks that are typically embedded in the arena? The move's effectiveness seems to exceed what wind should accomplish. Sweet Scent attracts wild Pokémon, functioning as the opposite of Repel by increasing encounter rates when used. The scent supposedly lures creatures toward the user, though what exactly makes it sweet or appealing to various Pokémon species remains unexplained. Different types with vastly different biologies all respond to the same scent. Honey works similarly to sweet scent, but as a consumable item smeared on special trees. Pokémon arrive to investigate the honey and can be battled when the trainer returns hours later. But the honey never seems to actually feed them. It just draws them to trees, where they wait indefinitely for trainers to show up. These field moves and items create gameplay, convenience, by providing specific solutions to obstacles the games place in your path. They work through game design rather than consistent internal logic, existing to enable progression rather than simulate realistic tool use. Another quiet detail appears when examining how Pokemon centers operate economically. These facilities provide completely free healthcare for all Pokemon without charging for services, medicine, or overnight stays. Nurse Joy maintains these centers alone or with minimal staff, somehow managing constant patient flow from trainers who stop by repeatedly. The centers exist in every town and city, suggesting a massive government-funded healthcare system that provides unlimited free treatment. But no taxes or fees support this infrastructure, and the games never show how Pokemon centers obtain resources or pay staff. They simply exist as perpetual free services that trainers use without question. Pokemarts coexisting with Pokemon centers in many locations creates an odd dichotomy. Healthcare is completely free, but supplies must be purchased at fixed prices. The economic model suggests society values Pokemon health highly enough to subsidize all medical care while still operating normal retail economies for other goods. Some towns have Pokemon centers, but no marts, forcing trainers to travel elsewhere for supplies. This creates communities entirely focused on healthcare without commercial infrastructure, suggesting they serve as pure healing waypoints along routes between cities. The machines in Pokemon centers heal all status conditions, injuries, and restore PP to moves, functioning as complete restoration devices. The healing happens instantly, with no waiting period, suggesting technology far beyond contemporary medicine. Yet this incredible technology apparently only works on Pokemon and cannot be adapted for human use. Perhaps Pokemon physiology makes them uniquely responsive to the healing technology. Their ability to survive inside Pokeballs might create biological compatibility with medical devices that operate on similar principles. Or maybe Pokemon possess enhanced natural healing that the machines simply accelerate to instant completion. Pokemon centers in dangerous locations raise questions about safety and access. A center in the middle of Victory Road serves trainers attempting the Elite Four challenge, but how does Nurse Joy reach it safely? Does she live there permanently or commute through areas filled with high-level wild Pokemon? The games never acknowledge the logistical difficulties these isolated centers should face. Some regions have floating Pokemon centers on water routes, providing healing services to trainers surfing between islands. These floating facilities presumably must be maintained and supplied, despite being surrounded by ocean. The infrastructure required to support them should be substantial, yet they operate identically to land-based centers. The consistent design of Pokemon centers across all regions suggests standardization that requires either governmental coordination or corporate franchising. Every center features the same layout, equipment, and nurse joy. This uniformity implies a centralized system maintaining centers globally, though no organization claims credit for this massive undertaking. Gyms follow similar standardization patterns, with each featuring a specific type specialty and puzzle elements that trainers must solve before challenging the leader. But why do gyms need puzzles? These obstacles exist purely to gate progression and create gameplay variety, not because there's logical reason why gym battles should require solving sliding ice puzzles or navigating invisible maze floors. Some gym puzzles pose legitimate danger. Blaine's Gym in Kanto features quiz questions where wrong answers trigger battles, but the Cinnabar Gym also contains floors that could burn trainers who step on them repeatedly. Brock's Gym has no lighting in some versions, forcing trainers to navigate complete darkness. These hazards would violate numerous safety regulations in any realistic setting. Gym leaders wait at the end of their facilities, accepting challenges from any qualified trainer who reaches them. But what do they do the rest of the time? Do they maintain their gyms, train constantly, or have other jobs? Lance serves as a gym leader while also being a member of the Elite Four in some versions, suggesting some leaders hold multiple positions simultaneously. The badge system creates a power hierarchy where trainers must prove themselves worthy before accessing certain areas or using specific HM moves outside battle. But badges are simply tokens awarded for defeating gym leaders. They don't actually grant power or ability, yet somehow they enable HM use as if they contained unlocking codes that remove restrictions. Perhaps badges function as official licenses granted by regional authorities. Gym leaders serve as government-appointed testers who verify trainer capability before issuing permits. This would explain why badges are required for HM use, their legal authorizations rather than power sources. But the games never explicitly confirm this interpretation. The Elite Four challenge requires trainers to battle 4 consecutive opponents, plus the champion, without healing between fights. This creates an endurance test that goes beyond simple strength, requiring team building that accounts for sustained combat without recovery. But the Elite Four themselves presumably don't battle continuously. They wait for challengers and fight fresh each time. Some Elite Four members specialize in types that create obvious disadvantages. Lorelei uses ice types that are weak to common attacking types like fire, fighting, and rock. Agatha relies on poison types that were notoriously weak in Generation 1. These specialists reach the highest competitive level despite handicapping themselves through type restriction. Type specialists showcase mastery of specific elements, but they create predictable strategies that prepared trainers can exploit. Bringing one strong counter type often allows sweeping entire teams. This suggests either type. Mastery provides unexpected advantages that overcome predictability, or the Elite Four accept disadvantages as points of pride. The champion represents the pinnacle of regional training, standing as the strongest trainer players must defeat. But champions vary wildly in team composition, with some using balanced teams, while others follow type themes. This creates different philosophy approaches to reaching the top, suggesting no single strategy dominates competitive battling. Blue's champion team in Generation 1 features multiple strong Pokémon, including Alakazam, Raiden, and a starter advantaged against yours. His team suggests preparation and adaptability matter more than type specialization. Meanwhile, Lance uses mostly dragon types, despite their rarity, making full dragon teams difficult to assemble. Defeating the champion earns the trainer entry into the Hall of Fame, an electronic database that records champion teams for posterity. But this database exists in the Pokemon League building itself, not accessible anywhere else. Why commemorate victories in a location most trainers never return to after becoming champion? Becoming champion creates a strange situation where the protagonist technically holds the highest training rank in the region. Yet NPCs continue treating you as a regular trainer. Gym leaders don't acknowledge your superior position, and you can't actually function as champion with challengers to defend against. The title exists purely as an achievement marker. Some games address this by having the champion retain their position while the protagonist becomes a different kind of recognized trainer. Others simply ignore the implications of becoming champion, allowing you to continue adventuring without the responsibilities that should accompany the title. Post-game content often includes harder challenges like battle facilities or legendary Pokemon hunting. These activities exist outside the main storyline, providing optional difficulty for players who want to continue after becoming champion. Battle towers, battle frontiers, and similar facilities test teams against AI using competitive strategies. Battle facilities employ rental Pokemon or strict rule sets that force its adaptation beyond normal playthrough teams. Some that prohibit using legendary Pokemon, others require level synchronization, creating environments where the optimized teams built for story content don't work. This tests true training skill by removing overleveling advantages. Rental systems provide pre-built Pokemon for trainers to borrow, preventing reliance on personally trained teams. This creates equal footing where success depends on understanding Pokemon capabilities rather than grinding levels or breeding perfect IVs. But rental Pokemon often have suboptimal movesets or natures, adding challenge through forced suboptimal choices. Battle facilities offer rewards, including rare items, move tutors, and special Pokemon that can only be obtained through competitive success. This incentivizes participation for completionists who want to collect everything. But the difficulty spike between story battles and facility challenges can shock players expecting similar difficulty curves. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, consider how Pokemon communication works. They can understand human speech perfectly, responding appropriately to complex commands during battles. But humans cannot understand Pokemon speech, hearing only their species' names or cries rather than actual language. This creates a one-way communication barrier where trainers give orders and Pokemon follow, but direct conversation remains impossible for most humans. Some individuals, like N, possess the ability to understand Pokemon speech, suggesting it's a learnable or psychic skill rather than linguistic impossibility. Meowth in the anime speaks human language fluently after teaching itself, proving Pokemon possess the intelligence and vocal capability for human speech. Yet almost no other Pokemon in the franchise display this ability, suggesting either Meowth is exceptionally gifted or most Pokemon choose not to learn human language. Perhaps Pokemon communicate perfectly well in their own languages, and the cries that humans hear represent simplified phonetic patterns rather than true speech. Pokemon might be having complex conversations that humans perceive as repetitive name-calling because we lack the ability to parse their actual linguistic content. The games feature Pokemon making decisions, showing personality, and demonstrating clear sapience. They're not simple animals following instincts. They're intelligent beings capable of complex thought. This raises ethical questions about training, battling, and keeping them in Pokeballs that the games carefully avoid addressing directly. Some Pokédex entries describe Pokemon as more intelligent than humans. Alakazam supposedly has an IQ of 5,000 and remembers everything it experiences. Metagross has intelligence matching supercomputers with 4 brains working simultaneously. Yet these ultra-intelligent beings serve trainers without apparent resentment or desire for independence. Maybe Pokemon genuinely enjoy battling and training, finding fulfillment in partnership with humans. Or perhaps catching them fundamentally changes their consciousness, making them loyal through mechanisms the Pokeball imposes. The games never clarify whether trained Pokemon are truly happy or just conditioned to obey. Wild Pokemon attack humans on sight in tall grass, but trained Pokemon never threaten their trainers. This suggests training creates bonds that override aggressive instincts. Or maybe Pokemon respect strength, demonstrated through capture, following trainers because they lost the initial battle. The battle system itself raises questions about Pokemon ethics. Trainers command their partners to fight until fainting repeatedly as a method of growing stronger. Pokemon gain experience through combat, suggesting battle genuinely helps them develop. But the constant fighting could be traumatizing rather than growth promoting. Friendly rival battles happen constantly, with characters challenging you to fights multiple times throughout your journey. These rivals treat you as friendly competition, but they never seem bothered by losing repeatedly. They congratulate you, share tips, and continue traveling without resentment, despite you constantly defeating them. Some rivals start as antagonistic, but warm up over time as they lose repeatedly and learn life lessons. This character arc treats battle defeats as teaching moments that build character, but losing competitive battles typically causes frustration, yet Pokemon rivals respond to loss with positive growth. Evil team battles create scenarios where you're fighting criminals actively committing crimes. Team Rocket steals Pokemon, Team Plasma kidnaps and abuses creatures, yet you resolve these conflicts through Pokemon battles rather than calling authorities. The battle system becomes a universal solution to all conflicts regardless of their nature. Defeating evil team members causes them to abandon their plans temporarily, but they rarely face lasting consequences. They pay you money and leave, continuing their organization's activities elsewhere until the next encounter. The lack of actual law enforcement creates a world where might makes right, with strong trainers able to impose their will through battle victories. Criminal organizations employ grunts with weak Pokemon teams that the protagonist easily defeats. These are supposed to be seasoned criminals, yet they use unevolved basic Pokemon even late in the story. Either they're terrible at training, or the organizations recruit incompetent members. The grunt teams exist to provide easy battles rather than create realistic threat levels. Boss battles against team leaders provide significant difficulty spikes, with executives using evolved Pokemon with better movesets. But these leaders still lose to the protagonist, who defeats the entire criminal organization almost single-handedly. Regional authorities seemingly wait for a child to solve their problems rather than addressing threats with professional resources. Some regions have dedicated police officers, like Officer Jenny, but they never intervene in major criminal activity. The police exist to maintain background order while trainers handle actual threats. This creates a society where martial prowess through Pokemon battling matters more than formal law enforcement. International police exist in some games, investigating criminal organizations across regions. Looker appears as an Interpol agent who assists players while investigating various teams. But even international law enforcement relies on trainers to actually confront threats, rather than having specialized police Pokemon teams. This suggests either legal restrictions prevent police from battling criminals directly, or Pokemon battling operates under cultural rules that even criminals and law enforcement respect. Battles function as formalized conflict resolution that takes precedence over other legal systems. HMs creating permanent moves that cannot be normally forgotten reflects how field abilities become integrated into Pokemon once learned. The move deleter provides the only method to remove HM moves, suggesting they're more fundamental than TM moves or level learned techniques. But why would some moves become permanent while others can be freely forgotten? Perhaps HM moves alter Pokemon at deeper levels, changing their capabilities permanently until a specialist reverses the process. Or maybe HMs represent certifications that society tracks, preventing deletion without official documentation. The move deleter might be a government official who processes legal forms rather than a simple service. The move deleter and move rememberer create a system where Pokemon can recall any move they've ever learned, suggesting perfect genetic memory of all techniques they've accessed. This allows strategic flexibility, where players can change movesets freely with these NPCs' help, adapting teams to different challenges. But move tutors charge resources like shards or battle points to teach moves, creating economic costs for accessing specific techniques. Why does remembering old moves cost nothing while learning new ones requires payment? Perhaps remembering taps existing knowledge, while tutors must actively train new skills. Some move. Tutors teach moves Pokemon could never learn otherwise, providing access to coverage options that dramatically improve certain species. These tutors appear in specific locations and only teach limited move selections, creating scarcity that makes their services valuable. The Pokemon World Championships exist within the universe as an actual tournament that the protagonist can optionally participate in some games. This creates a canon competitive scene where trainers gather to battle at high levels. But the championship doesn't impact story progression, and most NPCs never mention it, making it feel disconnected from the main narrative. Double battles and triple battles introduce multi-Pokemon combat that requires different strategic thinking. Team synergy matters more when multiple Pokemon fight simultaneously, creating opportunities for combinations and cooperation. But many NPC trainers never use these battle formats, suggesting singles battles remain the dominant competitive mode. Rotation battles allow switching between three Pokemon without losing a turn, creating dynamic fights where positioning matters as much as moves. But rotation battles appear rarely, implemented in only specific generations. The complexity may have deterred players or proved difficult to balance competitively. Horde battles pit one trainer Pokemon against 5 wild opponents simultaneously, creating overwhelm scenarios. These battles were introduced to make EV training more efficient, allowing players to fight multiple opponents at once for faster stat gain. But narratively, fighting 5-on-1 creates situations where the wild Pokemon should easily overwhelm solo opponents. Sky battles restrict participation to flying types and Pokemon with Levitate, creating a specialty format where only aerial combatants qualify. These battles occur mid-flight against trainers on cliff tops or in tall grass. But the camera angles and limited participation made them unpopular, leading to their removal in later generations. Inverse battles reverse all type effectiveness, making weaknesses into resistances, and vice versa. This creates a puzzle format where players must remember the type chart backwards, completely changing strategic calculations. But inverse battles remain optional curiosities rather than major competitive formats. Wonder Launcher battles in some games allow using items from a shared pool during combat, creating battles where item strategy matters as much as team composition. The launcher charges points each turn that unlock more powerful items. But this format never caught on and disappeared after one generation. These experimental formats show Game Freak trying to create variety in battles beyond standard singles and doubles. But most experiments don't persist across generations, suggesting either technical limitations or player preference for traditional formats keeps them from becoming permanent features. Contest stats create a separate progression system where Pokemon compete on beauty, coolness, cuteness, cleverness, and toughness instead of combat ability. These stats improve through feeding Pokemon specific berries or cooking poffins. Contests judge performances based on these stats combined with appeal moves during talent portions. But contest stats are completely disconnected from battle stats. A Pokemon can have maximum beauty while having terrible combat stats, and vice versa. This creates alternate progression for players who prefer non combat activities. But the investment required to max contest stats provides no battle benefits, creating tension between contest and battle focus. Contests feature in several regions, but disappear in others, suggesting not all cultures value performance competitions equally. Hoenn and Sinnoh prominently feature contests, while other regions ignore them entirely. This geographic variation implies contests are cultural rather than universal Pokemon training traditions. Super Contest shows in Sinnoh added rhythm game elements where players time button presses to music. This minigame tests reflexes unrelated to Pokemon training, creating skill checks that have nothing to do with team building. But contest rankings depend partly on these rhythm games, making musical timing important for winning. Musicals in Unova replaced contests with dress-up performances where trainers coordinate outfits and props for their Pokémon. The focus shifted from stats and appeals to visual presentation and choreography, but musicals provided even less gameplay depth than contests, existing mainly as cosmetic customization features. Pokémon Showcase and Kalos returned to performance competitions, but simplified mechanics significantly. These showcases involved cooking, styling, and performance rounds that determined winners. But showcase victories provided no tangible rewards beyond titles, making them optional side content with minimal impact. Pokemon Amy allowed physical interaction through petting and feeding Pokemon on the touchscreen. Building affection through these activities provided battle benefits, finally creating mechanical incentives for bonding activities. But Amai's benefits were modest, and many players ignored the feature entirely. Refresh expanded on Amy by adding care elements after battles, allowing trainers to clean dirt or status effects from Pokemon. This created a hygiene system that rewarded post-battle maintenance, but Refresh remained optional, with Pokemon centers providing the same cleaning instantly without player input. Camp and Sword and Shield let trainers play with their entire team while cooking curry. The camping system encouraged breaks during adventure to bond with Pokemon casually. Curry cooking became a surprisingly deep minigame with hundreds of possible recipes. But camps existed purely for affection building with no story integration. These bonding systems try to simulate trainer-Pokemon relationships beyond combat, but they remain supplementary features that players can completely ignore without missing core content. The games struggle to make relationship building feel essential rather than optional. Trainer customization in recent games lets players change their character's appearance through clothing and hairstyle options. This personalization makes protagonists feel more individual compared to fixed sprite designs from earlier generations. But customization is purely cosmetic with no gameplay impact. Some regions lock certain clothing behind version exclusives or event distributions, creating collection goals for completionists. But clothes matter so little mechanically that most players never engage deeply with fashion systems. The feature exists for players who care about appearance without forcing participation. The Pokemon world contains ancient ruins with functioning technology thousands of years old. The ruins of Alf contain puzzles that activate when solved, suggesting ancient civilizations built self-maintaining mechanisms. But how does thousand-year-old technology continue working without maintenance or power sources? Some ruins contain legendary Pokémon that have slept for centuries waiting for worthy trainers. These creatures awaken when the protagonist approaches, implying they can sense trainer potential even while dormant. But what constitutes worthiness, and how do they judge it while sleeping? Ancient civilizations and Pokemon lore often possessed advanced technology that rivals or surpasses modern capabilities. The Draconid people knew about meteorites and space Pokemon. The people of Ekrutake built the brass and burnt towers that attracted legendary beasts. These ancient peoples understood Pokemon relationships that modern civilization still researches. Perhaps ancient humans worked more closely with legendary Pokemon, gaining knowledge directly from mythical beings. Or maybe catastrophes destroyed advanced civilizations, forcing humanity to rebuild from lower technology levels. The games hint at cyclical rise and fall patterns without confirming specific timelines. Unknown appear in ruins as living hieroglyphs that form words and sentences. These psychic types have no practical use in battles, but serve narrative purposes in several games. Their mysterious nature and connection to ancient writing suggests they might be closer to dimensional beings than the normal Pokemon. The anime depicted Unknown creating reality warping effects when gathered in large groups, granting wishes or manifesting thoughts into physical form. This portrayal makes them potentially the most powerful Pokemon despite terrible combat stats. But games never give them similar reality-bending capabilities. Legendary Pokemon origin stories describe world creation events that sound mythological, but the games treat as historical fact. Dialga, Palkia, and Giratina shaped time, space, and antimatter at Arceus's direction. These aren't metaphorical stories, but literal descriptions of how the universe formed. If legendary Pokemon actually created reality, catching them in regular Pokeballs seems absurd. How can portable spheres contain beings that control fundamental forces? Either the balls are more powerful than acknowledged, or legendary Pokemon allow themselves to be caught for mysterious reasons. Some legendary Pokemon have multiple forms with different stat distributions. Giratina shifts between altered and origin forms depending on location. Shaman changes from land to sky form with Gracidia flowers. These transformations suggest legendary Pokemon aren't fixed, but adapt to circumstances or environments. Form changes create situations where one Pokemon effectively becomes two distinct entities with separate competitive viability. Giratina origin form has different typing and stat spreads that suit different strategies than altered form. This flexibility makes certain legendary Pokemon more valuable than those with single forms. Mythical Pokemon distribute exclusively through events, creating time-limited windows where players can obtain them. Missing these events means those Pokemon remain unavailable until future redistributions that may never come. This creates artificial scarcity that has nothing to do with in-game rarity or lore. The distinction between legendary and mythical Pokemon is often unclear to casual players. Both categories feature rare, powerful individuals, but mythical Pokemon hide behind event distributions, while legendary Pokemon appear in normal gameplay. This business decision dressed as lore creates frustration for completionists who cannot catch them all without waiting for events. Some mythical Pokemon received virtually no story integration despite their supposed importance. Shaman and Darkrai play significant roles in Sinnoh lore, but were event exclusive in the original Diamond and Pearl. Players who missed events never experienced the Pokemon central to regional mythology. Later games retroactively made some mythical Pokemon available through normal play, acknowledging that exclusive events prevented too many players from accessing content. But this inconsistent availability creates confusion about which Pokemon are catchable and which require waiting for announcements. Regional forms introduce alternate versions of existing Pokemon adapted to different environments. Alolan forms showed Kanto species evolving differently in tropical climates, gaining new types and abilities. This concept makes evolutionary sense, with isolated populations developing distinct traits. But regional forms exist simultaneously with original forms, suggesting they diverged recently enough that both versions survive. Evolutionary divergence typically requires thousands of generations, yet trainers can obtain both forms within their lifetime. The timeline compresses dramatically for gameplay purposes. Galarian forms expanded this concept, showing how Galar's environment shaped different evolutionary paths. Some Galarian Pokemon gained pre-evolutions that original versions lacked, suggesting evolution itself changes based on regional pressures. But this creates situations where the same species has different evolutionary chains depending on geography. Hisuian forms in Legends Arceus depicted ancient versions of Pokemon before modern forms developed. These historical variants showed how species changed over time, with some losing abilities or changing types as their environments shifted. But the timeline between Hisui and modern regions seems too short for major evolutionary changes. Thanks for watching. If these quiet stories helped you unwind, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. Feel free to let it play in the background. You may learn something new as you drift off.